So, welcome to this conversation on tipping points. Tilting to green, can positive tipping points accelerate sustainable solutions? My name is Linda Berenius. I work as Head of Development at the Global Challenges Foundation, a Swedish non-profit organization that seeks to raise awareness of global catastrophic risks and how global governance better can handle those risks. We have to halve the emissions every decade to be able to reach the 1.5 degree targets. And besides the climate crisis, the planet also faces other environmental related crises. Yesterday I spoke to Tilmisa, who is, she's here today. She's a UN ambassador of the Maldives, and a country that are severely affected already by climate change and fighting for the country's existence. And we talked about the global halving of emissions that's needed until 2030. And she reminded me that it's 90 months left to 2030. That gives us a sense of the urgency. We often hear about the risk of crossing tipping points that will put our planet in an irreversible state. But what does that mean? And are there positive tipping points? And if yes, how can we benefit for them? We will explore that today for about 1 hour. It will be room for posing questions. And directly after the conversation, the artist himself, Mats Bigert, will exclusively show his artwork in the park 10 minutes from here. That show will start 3:30. This whole event, art installation and talks, is a cooperation between the Institute for Future Studies, the Research Council Formas, the City of Stockholm, the Liljevalchs Art Gallery, and the Global Challenges Foundation. With us today, we have a fantastic panel with world-leading researchers, experts, and the artist himself. So I would first like to welcome up on the stage Mats Bigert. Please have a seat. One half of the artist duo, Bigert and Bergström, who created the artwork Tipping Point. The duo met at the Royal Institute of Art in Stockholm, 1986, and since then they've done artworks and projects ranging from large-scale installations, sculptures, to performance and films, often with a conceptual edge. And the core of the work is positioned between humanity, nature, and technology. We have Jujita Gupta, Faculty Sustainability Professor at the University of Amsterdam and co-chair of the Earth Commission, who's trying to save the planet in a just way. We have Arunabha Ghosh, the founder and CEO of the Council of Energy, Environment and Water, based in New Delhi, and one of the world's leading think tanks. We have Laure Marine Villard, Diplomatic Coordinator for World Youth for Climate Justice. And we have Magnus Giborn, Head of Research at the Global Challenges Foundation, philosopher and former chairman to the Swedish Peace and Arbitration Society.
Thank you.
So I would just like to begin by asking you a question. I just read an interview with Alok Sharma, who chaired the climate meeting in Glasgow last autumn. And in this interview, he's now in Stockholm for Stockholm Plus 50, the big UN meeting on environment, and he said that he thinks that the 1.5-degree target is still reachable. Do you agree with that, Mats?
Are you asking me? Well, I just heard an interview with Andreas Malm this morning, and he was outlining the prospect of reaching this goal, and it seems highly unlikely, I think. I mean, all fossil fuel producer have to sort of cut everything very fast. I mean, I hope it's possible, but it looks dark from my perspective.
Jojita?
Well, it's very necessary. And the question is whether we can do it also in a just manner. So in addition to what you are saying, which is the need for multinationals to cut down, we are basically asking also 150 other developing countries to massively reduce their fossil fuels very quickly. And that's going to be quite difficult to do unless we take a just approach. So if with a just approach, maybe it's within reach.
Arunabha?
Well, I'm going to use the example of the pandemic. You know, when the current pandemic struck, we thought that the only way to develop a vaccine was a 36 to 48-month cycle. And then we got a vaccine within about a 15-month cycle. The point is, technologically, if we put in our resources, I think 1.5 is certainly possible if we put a sort of whole of system effort. But I completely agree with what Joyita is saying. What will that end up costing us? Not in terms of money, but what else will we lose in the process? Will we lose justice? Will we lose equity? Will we lose a sense of empathy? So it's not just where you go, it's how you go there is as important to me.
Thank you. Laure Marine, do you think it's possible?
I mean, it's wonderful to hear that it's possible, but of course we would need action for it to be possible, because right now with the state of dialogues and international dialogue, what happened in Stockholm Plus 50 this week, we're clearly lacking action and engagement from different governments. But like Jojita said, we need to do it in a just way and an equitable way for all countries over the world.
Thank you. Magnus?
I would say that yes, it's clearly possible. All we have to do is stop burning fossil fuels. So the real problem is to do that and keep up welfare, or not only keep welfare, but also to develop welfare for the large share of humanity that has not yet. So that's the real challenge. And yeah, I think that it will take both technological development, but also redistribution of the existing. We need to work on many fronts at the same time. I think it's unlikely, perhaps, that we will, but we need to keep fighting for it.
Good. So we keep our hope. And do what we can. Mats, please, would you like to tell us about your artwork, Tipping Point?
Well, you see a sketch here. It's a model without people on these different platforms. So it's a kind of a physical flow chart of many of these discussions that climate change has faced us with. And we started to work, as you said, in 1986. And at that time, it was more focused on the environment, but it grew into a larger perspective of climate change. And I just want to mention that across the street, a bit further away, there's this museum called the Biological Museum that was built in 1893. And it was made by Gustav Kolthoff and Bruno Liljevalchs. And it was like artists collaborating with natural science. And we were really inspired by that early. And we started to build dioramas that we also populated with live performers, and we started to make our performances. So this is a continuation of that work with performance, and also trying to get the audience to come in and to engage in these questions. Also approach physicalities like climate and weather in real time. I remember when we were at school in the 80s, most art was shown in the white cube, and for us that was kind of an end station is like the modernistic idea of creating a perfect, comfortable zone. But the real world is out there. So as artists, is also this attempt of trying to bring that into the discussion, the real physical phenomena. Since we usually sit and talk in these kinds of settings, it's fantastic to be able to make an artwork that also can, bring people into a more of a physical experience. But we'll get back to that later. And finally, I just want to say that we're talking about tipping points today, and this is also could be seen as a diagram over cascading tipping points, or many balance points that has to be negotiated together. And I think that's also what we're going to hear more about now.
Thank you. And Magnus, can you help us to sort out what is a tipping point?
Yes, I need some stuff to help me do that. No, actually, tipping point in physics is exactly what it says. It is the point where an object tips. So it's the maximum angle that you can tilt an object before it tips over. So the tipping point is the balance point. So if you push the object a little bit in that direction, it will return to its original stable state. But if you push it slightly in the other direction, it falls. So it involves multiple stable states and some balance point between them. And you need to think, in order to get to the tipping point, it requires some forcing, some external force. You need to push it some way. And can I have a few minutes to tell a story that is, since we're here at Djurgården, there is another museum very close, the Vasa Museum, that some of you might have seen. And there is a ship from the 17th century, Vasa, the royal warship Vasa. It was built in the 1620s to become a flagship of the Swedish Baltic Navy. And 1628 it took its maiden journey. Very close from here, it's set sails. And this was a very powerful warship. It had 2 full gun decks with 64 bronze cannons. And it was the king himself who wanted a second gun deck of the ship. So it was, I think, the most powerful warship for its time. But the problem was that if you put 2 gun decks, it also has a very high center of gravity, so it becomes unstable. And a couple of weeks before the maiden journey, they made a stability test of the ship. So the crew was running from one side to another one, but they had to abort the test because it was at risk of capsizing the whole ship. But no one dared tell the king about this. So the ship set sails anyway on its maiden journey, and they had the gun ports open to be able to fire a salute. And it passed by just outside here, and it came just a few nautical miles before there was a slight breeze that caused the ship to tip a little bit like that. And you know that ships are stable in the sense that when the wind catches them, they can lean over a bit. But then as soon as you ease the sails or the wind stops, it goes back to its original position. But the problem with Vasa was that very slight breeze caused it to tilt over. And then the open gun ports reached the sea level. So the water started rushing into the ship. And then, even if the crew would ease the sails, that didn't matter anymore because the water flowing into the ship would then have, that caused a new process that caused the ship to tip over more and more, and then you couldn't save it. So that is like, when the water rushes into the gun port and fills then it has passed the tipping point, then you cannot do anything more. So first you have an external force, the wind, and then when you reach the tipping point, then a new process starts that is kind of unstoppable, that is accelerating by itself. So that is one example of a tipping point that is crossed, and I think that it has some relevance when we think about tipping points in the climate that we will also get back to.
Yeah, and speaking about the climate, why has this concept been important in the climate context? And anyone who has any examples there? Vijit or Arunabha?
So
anyone?
the concept of tipping points is very important in climate change because on the one hand, we already know that the sea level will continue to rise, but we also know that if suddenly the Arctic melts very fast, then it'd be impossible to reverse that process. If the Himalayas start to melt very fast, it'll be impossible to reverse that process. So what is happening is that we are emitting so much of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. This greenhouse gas concentration is leading to a number of positive feedback effects, and those feedback effects are difficult to unwind. And that's why we are so afraid. We are so afraid that the emissions we emit today will have impacts into the future, which may make many small island states completely disappear in the future. And that's why the tipping points are so important. We need to take action today to prevent something that might happen in the future. But also you can see small tipping points happening in different parts of the world where the ecological balance in a particular area collapses. And then to some extent you can recover those systems, but to a large extent, you can't change the hydrological cycle, and you can't change a species that is lost forever. So there are problems why we need to deal with these long-term impacts. But because these impacts are so far away, we have to make a connection to people's daily lives. Otherwise, people may not care about it, especially people who don't have enough money to come through the day or through the month or don't have a pension next year. For them, you have to try to make the link between a tipping point and their daily lives in order to get change.
Thank you.
Maybe I'll just pick up from where Joyita left off. This connection between what's happening somewhere far out there and what our lived reality is. Of course, here in Sweden, you are either very near the Arctic or within the Arctic, right? So it does matter what's happening. But back in, where I come from, India, it might seem something very far out, right? But the point is Arctic melt and the impact that will have on ocean circulation then has an impact on tropical monsoons, right? Which then has an impact on crop productivity, which then has an impact on food security and livelihoods. So it's this connecting of dots that doesn't always happen, right? And we walk out and say, oh, today the weather is bad, right? Or the weather is good, right? But the point is, it's because we are not connecting those dots that we are not able to, and I believe that is the number one failure we have, that the lived reality currently of, say, 5 billion people on the planet, which is about deprivation and poverty and lack of access to basic resources, etc., is also impacted by something that is seemingly far out there, but is actually already happening now, right? The fact that, we've had record heat waves in India right now, the hottest March since 1909, I believe, which is then impacting the harvest of the winter crop. This is in the month of May and June is when we harvest the winter crop. Now that then has an implication for policy around food security, which means that then exports of food grains from India then decline, which means that if, exports from Ukraine have also declined, etc., then what is happening to purely food importing countries, say in the Middle East, right? So there are these natural tipping points, and then there are, which might take slightly longer in the time span, but the immediacy of challenges and crises that hit, there are actually our social structures, our political structures, our administrative structures have far more vulnerable tipping points.
Yeah, I would just like to add something to that, emphasizing the urgency of this. Fiji alone has already had to relocate 33 different communities that had roots in these areas. So really tipping points have already been reached in small islands all over the Pacific and all over the world. So it is something that's happening right now, and we need to think about the lives of the communities that are in the front line of climate change.
And also, Marina, a question for you, like, because sometimes you also use like the term tipping points in a societal perspective, and you're also connected to the youth movement and so on. Could that be a possible, help us with a possible tipping point, you think, the youth movement? Would you like to elaborate a bit on that?
I mean, we certainly hope so. We've seen a sort of shift in the way we listen to youth in the government nowadays. There's more and more youth-led initiatives. For example, our initiative is pleading for an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice to rule in human rights and climate change, and we've been pushed by the government of Vanuatu. And really, the youth has had a huge impact on these voices. I mean, our campaign is just a tiny little dot in everything that's happening at the moment. So I definitely think that the voice of the youth can help shift the tipping point into a more positive way.
Yeah, would you like to comment on that?
I would like to, I would like to comment also on first what Arunabha said about like how different crises affect each other. I think that your artwork illustrates that very well, how the different tipping arms are connected. So if something happens in one arm, it will all fall. And you said something before when we talked about that this sculpture is actually really almost impossible. It shouldn't be possible to build it. And in a way, that is also, when you think about it, how connected our world is and how narrow the temperature range where humans can thrive, and also other biological systems that actually, when you think about it, it's almost impossible that we could live here. And the system is so sensitive, so that a very small change, and I think that's what the idea of tipping point teaches us, is that a very small push can have very big consequences. Those big consequences could be very bad for us, but it could also be that very small, well-directed policy measures could also have very strong positive consequences. Like when you get a movement over the tipping point, it could have a much stronger impact than we think. So I think that one thing that we can learn from the idea of tipping points is that, one, it's much worse than we think. Things may happen much faster and with much greater consequences than we think. So the situation is much worse. But it's also much better in the sense that we are more powerful than we think. We don't have to push the world all the way. If we only make some very well-targeted and timely interventions, we can make things happen much faster and with greater consequences that we believe. So,
Thank you. And I wonder here, do you agree with Magnus here that it's what, I mean, obviously I think all of you agree that it was much worse than most people think, but also that our possibility to change it is also bigger than we think due to positive tipping points. And so do you agree on that? And would you in that case like to give some examples on possible tipping points that we've already seen?
So for a social positive tipping point, you normally need a very good idea. You need a charismatic leader. You need some sort of attractiveness of the idea, or cost optimality, or something that makes people attracted to the leader and the idea. And then you need the right moment for it to actually start to spread. Let's just take cigarette smoking as an example. When I was growing up, it was really hip. Everybody was smoking, and it was like the normal thing to do. And then science showed us that you could actually die from cigarette smoking. And then you had all kinds of court cases taking place, and it took years before the courts were actually able to come back and say cigarette smoking is bad. And then you found the government started to say that we must ban cigarette smoking, and you must not smoke here, and you must not smoke there. And it became unfashionable in the West. And so you see a tipping point, and suddenly no one is smoking as much in the West. But I have another side, and that is the negative side of this whole story is that now 80% of the cigarette smoking is happening in the global south. And that means that what has happened is that the big companies have moved to the south, and they're trying to sell the idea that it's very fashionable and hip and modern to smoke there. And it will take some time. And there's a moral behind my story. We might be able to get a tipping point that works really well in the Western countries, but if somehow there's a leakage, and then that leakage leads to ideas being sold to the global south, then that tipping point will not work. And I'll give you an example. So even if you are absolutely right and her court cases work, and we're really able to push multinationals in the north not to use so much fossil fuel, and we're able to insist on governments to encourage the phase out, at the same time, we are seeing that knowledge about fossil fuel, expertise on fossil fuel is being funded by Western companies, Western investors, Western governments in the global south. Now, if you invest in something in the global south, it will probably have an 80-year lifetime depending on what kind of infrastructure you create. So you're creating a lock-in there, even if you can create a positive phase out here. And that's why we really need to keep in mind the global dynamics and learn a lesson from the cigarette smoking. We should have done it worldwide, and we didn't manage to do that. So,
How can we do that?
I think that we have to take a global perspective, and the global perspective cannot be done without a justice perspective. I'll give you another example, if I may. So in the north, most of us have used already all our fossil fuels. 82% and more of the fossil fuels that remain are in the global south. So it's, in around 150 countries. And basically, if we want to achieve the 1.5 degree target, we're asking the south to sacrifice not using their resources. Now, how do we force them? There's no way to force so many countries because they can buy and sell to each other, and especially if they're unable to make the link between the climate change problem and current day solutions, and if they don't have affordable technologies and opportunities to change. So it's really important to realize that in the global north, we lost control over the climate change problem because we did not take a justice approach. We should have started phasing out in 1990 when we knew about the problem in the north to make some space for the global south and also to inspire them to make the shift. We kept postponing because every time a prime minister or president comes to power, they're there for a short period of time and they want to just maximize the returns in their society. And this postponement of action in the global north is really a problem. And so I come back to my story that without a just approach, it's going to be very, very difficult to achieve a global change in behavior.
Thank you. Yeah, Arunaba?
I don't disagree with that, but I think there is, and I don't think Joyita is saying what I'm about to disagree with. But the point is, it's not, or the solution also is not a unidirectional set of solutions that starts in the global north and then ends up in the global south. I think one of the challenges we have with the lack of tipping points on the positive side is that we are not listening to the global south either. Not in terms of their calls for justice, but in terms of their actions, right? I want to just ask in the room, how many of you grew up with electricity? Right? Is there anyone in the room who did not grow up with motorized transport? Okay? From the global south, right? Like no access to motorized transport. Anyone here? Anyone here grew up without access to heating? Right? Are you from the global south? Or? Right. So there are people in this room, right? You don't have to watch a documentary on Netflix. There are people in this room who are from the global south, who within their lifetime, right, might have grown up without access to electricity. I grew up without access to any kind of motorized transport. who grew up without access to heating or cooling, right? This is our lived reality. You don't have to watch anything else, right? And our lived reality is very different. So when the same global south, how many of you know that 63% of emerging markets have already peaked or plateaued in the use of fossil fuels for the electricity generation? And yet we say it's the global south that has to change its electricity generation patterns. And the problem is, it is your pension funds, where you have invested your savings. This is a welfare state, right? But it's your pension funds that say, no, we will not invest in the global south because it's too risky. If it was too risky, how did the global south have 63% of peaking and plateauing? Do we have 63% of the global north that has peaked and started reducing their fossil fuel consumption for electricity generation? No. So the point is, the tipping point will only come when we first at least start looking around and seeing what happens. Because, sorry, I've been droning on for too long, but I see one, again, to go back to the pandemic example, crises help us to kind of act. A financial crisis, a food crisis, an energy crisis, a health crisis. But that is really, a 1 year, 2 year, 3 year cycle maximum, and then we forget. We have, as yesterday, one of the delegates, I think, from the Middle East said in the leadership dialogue, we have crisis amnesia, right? But the real change happens, real system change happens when the interests of the elite, and I count all of us here, including myself now, we are part of the global elite, and the interests of the vulnerable converge, right? And unless we find ways to actively create that convergence of interests between the elite and the vulnerable, I don't think we will listen, and therefore I don't think we will act.
But if I can come back, Arnav, I don't disagree with you. I think that the pathway for each country or each community to reach zero emissions or a more sustainable future is different. I don't think that we can have countries going up the GDP ladder and trying to come and use Western technologies and Western lifestyles. That's not going to work. I think we really have to figure out what will be the different pathways in different parts of the world, what is possible, feasible, desirable, and also gives well-being to people. But I still want to insist on the fact that who are living now in the West, we really have to reduce the amount of resources we use for our breakfast, for our lunches, for our transport. We just have to reduce that, because if we don't do it, we're not going to be able to move forward. But that doesn't necessarily have to be bad news. We can still have happiness with the same, with reduced resources. So it's a question of how we think about these things and how we frame them.
Thank you.
So I think art and maybe literature right now is trying to imagine these possible futures. And I just read Kim Stanley Robinson's latest book, The Ministry of the Future, and I want to ask you about that, because he paints up a very close future where, we have this catastrophe in the global south, in India, with this temperature, like wet bulb temperature, lots of people die. And then when there is action being made, and the national state is quite bad in handling this global problem. So they instate this ministry of the future, council, and then in the long run there's this carbon coin. I mean, that also has been a suggestion to deal with that even people in the global south get paid to actually put back carbon into the ground. And these kinds of ideas, it's very rare you hear from politicians or policymakers. So do you see them as completely utopian, or is this a way forward to create this kind of connecting the dots, finding the balance between the national states?
I think it's not about just the process, it's about the outcome, right? So let's take parallel metaphors, right? The developing world has been paid to accept waste from the West. So now parts of the developing world are saying, sorry, we're not going to accept your waste anymore, right? So suddenly the West, my colleague, we were walking around the island here for the entire morning, and my colleague said, this place is so clean that all my photographs have dustbins in them. right? But that's a metaphor for what basically we have said, what the world we have created, that it's somewhere else I read earlier this week, there is nothing called throw away, because the away is just another place where your waste ends up, right? Since the clean development mechanism was created, the developing world was meant to get money for absorbing, and creating a way to, mitigate the emissions. And then they did not end up getting the money. So my point is not that these mechanisms should not be there. Certainly we are all, and I think eventually it has to boil down to an individual level decision, not just a country level decision. Because my own personal footprint will certainly be far greater than the average Indian, right? So I cannot hide behind the average Indian and say, I don't have any obligation, right? But the only point I'm trying to make is there are also things happening, Kim Stanley Robinson's book starts with this dystopian view of Uttar Pradesh in India, right? It's Uttar Pradesh in India, which is would have been the world's, 6th or 7th largest country by population, desperately poor, but also where thousands of women-run NGOs are now going to, run distributed energy shops in every district, right? The world's largest program in natural farming, 800,000 farmers working in another state in India. And you wouldn't even have heard of them because the narrative that you read or see on your television is that, they're still burning coal and it's all their problem because we've cleaned up our act. And that's because your immediate environment is sanitized. No, your immediate environment is only sanitized because someone came in the morning with a waste pickup truck and shifted it out somewhere else.
Thank you. I must ask you, because it's so complex, everything, and also, your artwork is illustrating how complex it is. And
I wouldn't say illustrate. I wouldn't use the word. I would more talk about embodiment.
yeah, good.
It's not illustrative.
No, thank you. But maybe giving a sense of the complexity and the interconnections and so on. And I'm thinking maybe a question to all of you, like, what would be the most important decision for, like, policymaker or decision makers to avoid those negative tipping points, or to remove the barriers and reach the vision on a planet in balance? What would you say, Magnus?
I'm not sure that there is one decision that will solve it, because it is a complex problem and it will involve decisions on very many areas at the same time. And in many cases, one solution cannot be implemented by one type of this. You cannot really have climate policy as such. Climate policy is energy policy and labor market policy and industrial policy, and but one thing about mindset, I would say, think in terms of transition, not in terms of reducing emissions a little bit. I think that's really changed the mindset. We don't need to. It's not enough. It's good if we sort our waste at home and if we drive a little bit less, but that will not solve the problem. We need to change the way that we do things more. And then, if I may add something else, I think that you are completely right that we need to focus much more on the making development in the part of the world that is still behind possible without fossil fuels, because there's so much focus now on decarbonizing existing industries in rich countries, and that is necessary, but it will not solve the problem, because there is much more potential for emission growth in the countries. Just like getting to a decent standard of living has more potential of emission growth than the potential for emission reductions in just the. So I think that the real challenge that we are facing is to make sure that we can all develop to a decent standard of living without reliance on fossil fuels in the future.
Thank you. Marine, can you like see one that what you think is the most important, or does it have to be an answer that it's?
I would just say two things, listen and see, because often governments and politicians, I mean, I'm very lucky to be here and to be able to have a voice representing the youth, because often it's like they have like two things around their eyes and they only see one straight directions, only dialogues and only specific rooms, and they don't listen and they don't see what's around them or what's right in front of them. So that'd be extremely helpful. They would just listen and see.
And who shall listen and see?
Our governments, our representatives, yes.
I don't
But
know.
you asked for one, but maybe I'll give
Yeah?
two.
Okay, two is
one
fine.
Just to endorse what Magnus is saying. I think, again, going back to what I said, the convergence of the interests of the elite and the vulnerable. And we need to create these physical and virtual and metaphorical bridges between the so-called North and the so-called South. Because, if you make green steel in Sweden, that's wonderful. But the real steel consumption will happen in India or China or Indonesia, right? So how do you create global supply chains where everyone has a stake in, making a part of an electrolyzer, making a part of the steel, making part of the renewable energy, and so forth? It's because we've created markets which are exclusionary that we have these mercantilist trade wars that come up. But there is a different way of doing this, which is actually far more energy secure, which is far more resource secure, and gives everyone a stake in it. So that's one thing at a sort of economic level. But at a political level, I think the number one thing is to actually ask questions. And I was extremely encouraged 2 weeks after the Glasgow COP, when the winter session of the Indian Parliament started. We have 3 sessions, a winter session, a monsoon session, and a budget session. The winter session began in early December, and we have something, we follow a parliamentary system, so you have something called question hour, right? The session began with 2 questions that were linked to reports, research that my organization had done. One was on net zero pathways for India, and the other one was on climate risks of India. So when parliamentarians are different from government, from the executive, right? The executive is taking decisions on a day-to-day basis, but when parliamentarians ask questions, hang on, how are my constituents going to get affected by the next heat wave or by the next flood? And what is the government going to do about it, right? I think then we've got to bring that democratic process into this social and economic change that we are looking at. Start asking questions. Ask questions of your parliamentarians. Why are our publicly funded pension funds not investing in the global south? If we care about 1.5C, why isn't there more money going? Forget about 100 billion. Why aren't we getting more returns there, right? So let's start just asking questions. And that's why a forum like this, the artwork you're creating, sitting in a beautiful setting like this, I mean, we've got to get these conversations going completely outside of these so-called hallowed halls of climate negotiations, where some of us have blue passes, some of us have green passes, some of us have no passes. Right? Democracy is this. So please ask questions.
Great, thank you. And we'll see if we have any questions here soon. I will just hear what Jujita and Mats says, and then we will see if we can have any questions from the audience before we continue the discussion. Jujita?
So I'd like to add something to the discussion, which is that in the Global Environment Outlook, we looked at what is the underlying driver for environmental problems globally. And one of the key underlying drivers is our preoccupation with GDP growth, with profit maximization. And I remember that when we started the whole exercise, I was told by the Scientific Steering Committee, I was the co-chair of this project, so I was told by the Scientific Steering Committee, degrowth is off the table, you can't talk about it. And we did do it slightly differently in the report. And then yesterday or day before, our Secretary General of the United Nations announced that he feels GDP is out of date, and what GDP creates and how it externalizes both social and environmental issues. So I think one of the key storylines that we need to also bring to the table, in addition to all the brilliant ideas brought up here, is what is development and what is the content of it, what is possible given that we have limited resources that we can use. And don't forget, energy is not recyclable. We can use, it's renewable, but it's not recyclable. Even food to a large extent is not recyclable. So it's some of our resources that we can recycle, but even that we cannot recycle endlessly. So we really have to envision a world where we are less materialistic and we have more perhaps art and literature and music to enrich our lives and less, kilometers and options. So I think the issue of how do we define development has to come onto the table very fast. And in fact, the World Bank has to stop classifying countries in terms of GDP if we think this is serious.
Yeah, I heard that statement as well, and I thought it was quite radical. And he took as an example, he said that if we are like cutting down all our forests, that's creating GDP. So that was the example he used. So that was interesting.
Yeah, so maybe hopefully in the future when we've solved all these problems, which we will subsequently, it will take some time. Unfortunately, maybe we create a lot of white spots on the map, but then maybe we have like Vasa ship, which was like the biggest failure in Swedish history, which now is the biggest success because it's our most famous, place to visit when you come here to Stockholm. So maybe people in the future will go and see our artwork and look at it and go like, what is this? What did they think of? Oh, there was something about the climate, so there was a problem, but now it's just a museum covering this period in human history, So hopefully our art will be obsolete and we don't need to do this kind of artwork more in the future.
Yeah, let's hope for that. So thank you to all of you that came here, in spite of like the traffic chaos and marathon and everything. And thank you to this fantastic panel. To me, it has been really an interesting discussion to follow. So thank you all.